When we are developing on the spiritual path, one of the important principles is maintaining a balance. And there are a few ways that the Buddha spoke about maintaining a balanced practice. One of them is the idea of the 5 spiritual faculties, the 5 indriya. These are powers or faculties, abilities that we work on in our practice. And to be effective, they have to be developed in a balanced way. There are 5, and with one in the middle, they form 2 pairs that we might call inner pair and the outer pair. The faculty in the middle that's required all the time is sati, which is mindfulness. An older translation of sati was recollectedness. And I think this is actually better. Mindfulness has become very popularized in the culture today. We hear about mindfulness of this and that. And I think sometimes the meaning gets a little bit lost. It's really remembering to be present, being completely here and now, knowing who you are, where you are, what you're doing, and in particular, what is the object of consciousness at this moment. Sati is required at all times. It doesn't have a balancing partner. It's in the center. And Visuddhimagga gives an analogy and says sati is required at all times, just as salt improves the taste of all dishes. So I don't know, that's kind of dubious as culinary advice, but this is the idea of mindfulness, is to be the basis of all the others. We need mindfulness even to be aware of the presence or absence of the other factors. There's an inner pair, the next 2, that relate very immediately to meditation, to practice. These are saddha, which is faith or confidence, and panya, which is wisdom. And the idea is that the 2 must be in harmony. If they're out of harmony, if we have too much of one or the other, then it's not balanced, our practice goes wrong. Someone can have a great deal of faith, but no wisdom, then they'll believe any foolish thing and put all their trust in it. Kind of very stark example of this is, I don't know, was it 15 or 20 years ago, there was a comet came close to the Earth, and there was a cult of people somewhere in the southwestern United States that somehow come to believe that it was a spaceship steered by Jesus, and if they killed themselves at the right moment, they could get on board with Jesus on the spaceship. And they all did that. No one could fault those people for a lack of faith. They had plenty of faith in this harebrained notion, but there's no discriminating wisdom at all. Discriminating wisdom by itself, without counterbalance of faith, leads to the kind of a mind that's cold and dry and highly cynical and skeptical. And it's said that this is a kind of cunning, and it's as hard to cure as a disease caused by medicine. As people who are too clever for their own good. But when faith and wisdom are balanced, then we can use our discriminating wisdom to discern what makes sense, what's good, what's for our benefit. And then we can put our faith in that and practice in that way. And the strongest faith is the faith that's based on experience. An initial leap of faith is required even to begin to practice. But it doesn't carry you very far on its own. You gradually gain confidence in the way as you proceed, and you see results. And you use discriminating wisdom to judge, what makes sense, what is helpful, what is wholesome. So these are faith and discriminating wisdom. The other pair is the inner pair, is closer to immediate practice, is samadhi and viriya, which is the stability or unity of mind and the energetic factor. And this is very immediately related to meditation practice. Usually when people are trying to meditate and they're not doing well, they're not succeeding, they're finding it difficult, they're going off in one of two ways. I mean, there's a myriad of ways you can go off, but there are two general categories, two broad trends. One is falling into dullness, sleepiness, tiredness, boredom. And the other extreme is to be restless and agitated and jumpy and unable to keep still physically or mentally. These could be broadly categorized by the degree of energy, not enough energy or too much energy. And the counterbalancing factor to energy is samadhi. Samadhi is a difficult term to translate. It's usually, if you see it in English language literature about meditation, it's usually translated as concentration. I'm trying to avoid using that translation because I think it's misleading. It encourages people to force their mind onto the object. To concentrate means to make small, right? To restrict, to constrict. Whereas the mind with samadhi is wide open, expansive mind. It's actually defined in the old texts, in the Abhidhamma texts, as non-wavering. So its stability is the key factor, stillness. Stillness of mind. The mind is not jumping around, flitting from object to object. It's quiet and still and filled with a single object. This is samadhi. And it's very critical to develop energy and samadhi together. If you have too much energy, you're restless, then you're not able to still the mind. But if your mind is still, but you have no energy behind it, that's just sleepiness. You just fall into a dull torpor and either fall asleep or just have a dull, torporous kind of mind. The proper balance is an energized mind that's quiet and still. And knowing how to use these two factors is a very integral part of skill in meditation. And we use that central factor of mindfulness to determine where we are, what we need, where we need to pull it up. If you're experiencing a lot of restlessness, then you need more samadhi. The energy's too high. So the proper cure is to sit very still, be very quiet. On the other hand, if the mind is dull and sleepy, that's not the time to try and develop more samadhi. It's time to energize in some way. Get up and do walking meditation, open the eyes. Don't be too concerned about developing intense one-pointedness at this juncture. You need to, first of all, bring up the energy level so that then you can practice properly. Ajahn Chah used to talk about going against the grain, and a good shorthand for understanding this is that whatever the desire mind is telling you to do, you do the opposite. If you're trying to meditate and the mind has got too much energy and restlessness comes up, the mind will come up with 101 things you need to be doing right now. I need to sweep the floor, I need to go for a walk, I need to do this, I need to do that. And you need to ignore all of that and just sit still and quiet. You'll never subdue restlessness by giving into it. You have to fight it with stillness. On the other hand, if the mind is dull and sleepy, then you're happy just to throw a blanket around your shoulders and nod your head and have a little nap. Well, this is not the time to give in to that. It's not the time for stillness. It's the time to energize, to go for a walk, to open the eyes, in some way to energize the system. So these are the basic 5 factors of the 5 faculties. Mindfulness in the middle, the inner pair of samadhi or concentration or stability and energy, virya, and the outer pair of faith and wisdom, meaning discriminating wisdom. And they have to be developed in balance. Think of changing your tire on your car, and you have to tighten the lug nuts, one here, one there. I'll bring them all in together. If you crank one lug nut down all the way, you're going to warp the hub of the tire, and it's going to be bad results. So you have to bring the factors up. It's not that there's any such thing as too much energy, for example, but if there's lots of energy with no concentration, then it's going to be bad results. So you need to bring them up together. And then if there's good samadhi and good energy, then you have good practice and you get results. So now I'll turn the floor over to my colleague Tan Kimiko, and he'll continue.
So, here's a practical helper. You hold up one hand, you have on 5 fingers. If you hold up one hand like this, and go through the 5 fingers, and then here's the mnemonic. For excellent maturity, choose wisely. For excellent maturity, choose wisely. It's almost like eeny, meeny, miny, mo, right? But for is faith, excellent energy, M, maturity, mindfulness, choose, which is concentration, and then wisely, wisdom, right? So that's how you can remember it. For excellent maturity, choose wisely. And notice that the middle finger is the longest one, right? That's mindfulness. This is the chief of the 5 factors, or the 5 spiritual faculties. Not the chief. It's the one that doesn't require balancing. It's the one that you need the most of, you could say. So bear that in mind. So these 5 faculties, the word faculty, indriya, is named after the Vedic god Indra, whom is also known in Buddhism as Sakka. He's the king of the gods of the Tawa Tings heaven. And in that mythology, of course, being the king of the god, he has dominion. He has the power over the gods, the world in general. So these faculties, this indriya, are things which are sometimes called powers or balas. They're something that you can develop. Now what's interesting about them is they're already present. Everybody has them to some degree in their kind of ordinary consciousness. Like when you get in your car to drive somewhere, you're like, you could say you have the faith that you know how to drive, that you remember from yesterday how to drive. So you have faith that the destination you're going to is going to be there. So you have a certain kind of a confidence about how things are going to work. And like a lot of things in our practice, what we're doing with our Buddhist practice is we're taking something which is sort of a commonplace aspect of our minds, and we're developing it to a higher pitch. So we all have mindfulness, we all have concentration, we all have a little bit of wisdom at least. And so we consciously undertake to develop each one of these factors, which lead over time to flowering of wisdom, which is the final factor. In several suttas, the Buddha says that someone who develops these 5 spiritual faculties to their utmost perfection is an arahant, is a fully enlightened being. But someone whose development of those factors is weaker than that, well, that person is a non-returner, which is the next level of enlightenment down from an arahant. And someone whose faculties are weaker than that, they become a once-returner. And someone whose faculties are weaker than that, they're a stream enterer. And somebody whose faculties are weaker than that, they're what's called a Dhamma follower. And someone whose faculties are weaker than that, they're called a faith follower. So the arahant, the non-returner, the once-returner, and the stream enterer, these are all noble persons who have seen Nibbana. And the way they were able to see Nibbana is by developing these 5 faculties. The other 2, called the Dhamma follower and the faith follower, the Buddha declares that these are persons who have not yet seen Nibbana for themselves, so they haven't got confirmed confidence in their practice or in the Buddha or the Dhamma or the Sangha. They're still kind of wavering because they haven't seen yet for themselves. But he says that because of their undertaking of the development of these faculties, they're bound for stream entry. Sometimes they're called like a lesser stream enterer. So this is something that's developed through practice. He says that somebody who is completely devoid of these faculties, who doesn't have any faith, doesn't have any energy, etc., they're an outsider who stands amongst the collective of mere worldlings. So if you have some faith in the Buddha, then you're already an insider. You're part of the club now. And to some extent, as long as you keep cultivating that faith, you don't really have to worry about whether you're going to be born in an animal realm or not. The Buddha says you can't be born in an animal realm if you have faith. So this brings up an interesting exploration of what does it mean to have faith. But before I go there, I just want to go over our mnemonic one more time. For excellent maturity, choose wisely. Faith is the first one. And notice that the thumb is also like the strongest finger on your hand. So faith is like the starting point for the path. One who has faith will naturally be inclined to practice, and they'll develop energy for practice. And that person starts to put energy into practice, mindfulness develops quite naturally. They become more and more aware of what they're doing with their mind and their body. And as that mindfulness matures, it issues forth in greater and greater states of concentration. And at the pinnacle of concentration, the mind's able to see into reality in a way that it normally isn't able to. And when it sees deeply enough, that issues forth in the form of wisdom. This is a transcendent wisdom, which is the cause of enlightenment itself. So the 5 faculties can also be seen as the progression of the entire Eightfold Path. Starts with faith. From the faith, energy develops. From energy, mindfulness gets stronger. With mindfulness, concentration develops. And with concentration, finally, wisdom can be seen. So it sounds like, well, you have to start here, work on this one until you get it right, and then this one will appear next. But it doesn't really work like that. It kind of works in like a circular fashion. You put a little bit of time and effort into each one of them, and they all help each other grow. The Buddha compared them to the ridge and rafters of a roof. So he says, of these faculties, wisdom is reckoned as their chief, like you could say the most important one. It's like the point of the faculties. So he compares the faculty of wisdom to the ridgepole or the peak of a roof. The other ones are like rafters. So when you're building a roof, the rafters want to come together and join together, but they need something to rest on. And if they don't have anything to rest on, they're kind of wavering, they need to be braced up, they're kind of flopping around. But when you put a ridgepole down the middle, those rafters all touch that, and the ridgepole stabilizes them, and they support the ridgepole. So they work together to create the roof, and wisdom is the ridgepole, and the other 4 factors are the rafters in this analogy. So faith is the starting point, because without faith you can't begin. You can't really undertake any of the practices because you won't be convinced that it's worth your time or your effort. So everybody who's here, obviously listening to the talk, has some modicum of faith. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. You'd be doing something else. There's 10,000 things you could do right now in Thunder Bay. So being here listening to the talk is quite optional, and so it takes faith to show up and put forth the effort that it takes to actually come to something like this. But the question might be like, well, faith in what? Usually it's defined as faith in the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha. Faith in the Buddha means to, in your own mind, have the conviction that the Buddha himself was fully enlightened. There's a kind of a traditional recitation that we do at the beginning of most meditations. Itibiso bhagava arahang samma sambuddho vijja charana sampanno. So this is translated as, he is perfectly enlightened, he is impeccable in conduct and understanding, he's the knower of the worlds, he's a teacher of those who wish to be trained, he is teacher of gods and humans, he is awake, he is holy, the Buddha. So it's a kind of a profession of faith. The Dhamma is well expounded by the Blessed One. It's apparent here and now. It's timeless. It leads inward when it's followed. And it's able to be understood by each person, by each wise person for themselves. The Sangha are those noble disciples of the Buddha who have practiced well, who have practiced correctly, who have practiced the direct path and the right way. They're worthy of offerings, worthy of gifts, worthy of hospitality. They are an incomparable field of merit for the world. So these are kind of the traditional understandings of what it means to have faith. And each one of these is worthy of exploration because as a mere recitation, it can be kind of superficial. So you could sort of say that in order to really have faith, you have to cultivate faith. At some point, the teachings made enough sense to you that you thought you should explore it more and maybe try meditation and maybe come to a Dhamma talk. But to develop faith, it's important to actually put some effort in that direction, to try to understand the teachings more completely by, say, reading suttas, listening to Dhamma talks, having Dhamma discussions with friends, but most importantly, trying your own meditation practice. If you do those things, as you practice this practice, you'll start to see how correct it is, how well it works, how true what the Buddha was pointing out is about the truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, the truth of the cessation of suffering, and the way that leads to the cessation of suffering. Those are the four noble truths. When you start to see for yourself that these things are true, it starts to support that faith. So faith is a funny word because it sounds like it doesn't require any evidence. Like, the idea of like blind faith, that you should just have faith in something because someone with authority said it is true and therefore it must be true. In this teaching, you have to take certain things on faith that you have not yet seen for yourself, but you're taking it on the confidence of your understanding so far. Whatever understanding you've developed so far is the basis for the faith that's necessary for you to take the next steps in the practice. So it's interesting that you start off with a little bit of faith, you take on a little bit of the teaching, you see how it's true, that increases your faith, that gives you more energy to investigate even further, and that gives you more faith, and so this kind of creates this virtuous cycle where your faith, your energy, your mindfulness, your concentration, your wisdom all support each other, and they all create more faith, and your faith gets stronger and stronger and stronger. So faith is a certain kind of confidence based on evidence, based on actual experience. It's not a blind faith. So the energy that's spoken about, virya, in the suttas it says, the Buddha says that this energy is the energy that comes about from practicing the four right strivings. And so these are also called four right efforts. They're another one of the sets of lists of things that you can memorize. Think of it as like just two things. Develop the wholesome, abandon the unwholesome. That's right effort. It gets made into four things by saying, well, develop the wholesome, abandon the unwholesome. You can make that into four things by saying, whatever wholesome states have already arisen, support those wholesome states. Whatever wholesome states have not yet arisen, bring about those wholesome states. So it's both developing and sustaining wholesome states. And then whatever unwholesome states have arisen, abandon those unwholesome states. And whatever unwholesome states that have not yet arisen but could arise, suppress those. Right? So the four right efforts are basically developing and sustaining the wholesome and abandoning and suppressing the unwholesome. So if you do those two things, wholesome keeps getting stronger and stronger, unwholesome keeps getting weaker and weaker. That's right effort. When you undertake right effort, a certain kind of, you could say, spiritual energy becomes available to you. You start to have more and more interest in the practice. You start to see the benefits of it, because a wholesome mind, a mind which is occupied with wholesome dhammas, is a happy mind. And this is a practice of happiness. This is a practice that leads to ease, to peace, to contentment, to bliss, to tranquility. These are all good things that are worth pursuing. They're all wholesome things. So a mind that's pursuing these wholesome dhammas, cultivating the wholesome and abandoning the unwholesome, that mind will develop a kind of energy that's based on this happiness of wholesomeness. That energy is at your disposal. You can use it for any useful undertaking that you want to. Probably the best thing to use it for is to develop mindfulness. And mindfulness is the intentional directing of attention and remembering to keep doing that. You could say that's like a short version of what mindfulness is. You're intentionally directing your attention at something, like say the breath, or the sensations of walking when you're walking, or the posture of the body at any given moment, how your limbs are arranged. If your mindfulness is strong, you can start noticing the feeling of every moment of contact. You could notice the content of the mind, whether the mind is happy or sad, in a good mood or a bad mood, thinking about this or that. Being able to notice these things and see them arise and pass away, this is how mindfulness can be employed to develop the practice further. Mindfulness takes effort. Effort takes energy. Where do you get the energy? Well, that comes from right effort. And right effort only happens because you had faith. Right? So you can sort of see how these things kind of build on each other. Right? Finally, when mindfulness is strong, it's well developed, coming along nicely. So this can be just a half hour of sitting every day where you're seeing that you're able to put your mind on an object and have it stay there fairly consistently. And when it starts to wander off, you immediately recognize that the mind's wandering off, and you remember to come back, and then you actually do come back to the object. When you're able to do those things consistently, mindfulness is getting stronger. This is another aspect of cultivation. So you always start with where you are, whether it's faith, energy, mindfulness, concentration, or wisdom. You start where you are, and then you sort of push the edge of the envelope a little bit. You try to go a little further. You see, like, what's just within reach? What can I just, like yesterday I couldn't quite stay in the breath for 5 minutes, but maybe today I can do it for 5 minutes, right? So you're always kind of trying to lean into your practice and find what you can do to bring it along a little further. As you do this, you'll see how the strength that you develop in cultivating any one of these faculties lends you strength and you could say intrepidity, the ability to endure. It lends these things to you in every other aspect of your practice. When mindfulness develops, and this is especially true if you go on a meditation retreat or you take some significant time out of your normal routine and put more effort, like you spend an entire weekend developing meditation practice. When mindfulness comes to a certain degree of development, then quite naturally, without any particular effort, deeper states of concentration start appearing in the mind. So you put the mind on an object, and it stays on, not only does it stay in the object because you're intentionally trying to keep it there, but it starts to stay with the object because it's content, it's at peace, it's at ease. Other objects aren't coming in and trying to drag it away. And so this kind of collectedness is another word for concentration. Ajahn Punnadhammo just mentioned that concentration is not necessarily the best translation of the word samadhi, because it implies a kind of squeezing or a kind of grabbing a hold of and seizing onto. This is more like a kind of a gentle, like cupping your hand and allowing a drop of water just to stay in the palm of your hand, right? It doesn't take much effort to not dump it out, but only if you're not being pushed around by a whole bunch of other things. So this collectedness, this ability to comfortably and happily hold still mentally, is something that just develops as the result of this practice of developing mindfulness. Once mindfulness is developed and concentration starts to develop, concentration supports mindfulness. Mindfulness supports concentration. These two kind of form this virtuous pair that can go back and forth and feed into each other. And both of them, of course, are resting on the energy that you developed by attending to the wholesome and abandoning the unwholesome, which, of course, depended on the fact that you had faith in the first place to even try. And, of course, as you go up this kind of virtuous ladder and you start seeing these deeper states of concentration, your faith increases. It gives you even more energy to keep doing the practice. So as you're doing this, it's actually worth reflecting on how the spiritual faculties are doing. So if you've been consciously cultivating things and you notice that you're trying to develop mindfulness, but there's a lot of restlessness, it probably means that amount of energy or effort that you're putting in is a little too intense. As Ajahn Punnadhammo was just mentioning, there's two sets of the factors that need to be maintained in balance with each other. So faith has to be balanced with wisdom, and energy has to be balanced with concentration. So faith, wisdom, these two guys here, and then energy and concentration. They're all kind of pivoting on either side of mindfulness. Okay? So just remember, for excellent maturity, choose wisely. It's always important to reflect on how practice is going when you're doing practice. Sort of look into your own practice and see, am I restless? Am I bored? Am I obsessing about something? Am I not experiencing any happiness? Or am I experiencing happiness? Is my mind free of obsession with unwholesome dhammas? That kind of self-evaluation is how you lead yourself to what you need to do next. We all have to be our own teachers ultimately in this practice. It's important to have actual teachers to help us along the path. But in your own daily practice, in your own sitting practice, you have to be the one who judges like what's going right, what's not going right, and what kind of antidotes to try to bring to your practice. It's a little bit like developing say you're like an artist, and you're a painter, or you're an aspiring painter. You have to kind of develop your own style, how you do things. You have to understand your own inclinations, your own mind, and your own shortcomings, your own weaknesses, your own proclivities, your own strengths, and then use them accordingly. There isn't like a fixed, rigid formula that you can follow. It's almost like you have to discover what your mind really is, what it's really like, and then apply these understandings that you develop to that particular mind. It's always a custom job. There's no generic enlightenment. It's individual in every case. So as concentration develops, you're in a position to see more deeply into reality. And this is where we get to wisdom. It takes a little bit of wisdom to come to the practice in the first place. You can't be completely deluded and hear the Dhamma. The Dhamma only makes sense to people who've got some wisdom, some sort of native wisdom, you could say. Each one of these things is actually a conditioned Dhamma. It's something which has a cause. And faith is one of those ones that seems a little mysterious at first. There's a sutta in which the Buddha says, what is the cause and the condition for the arising of faith? Suffering. It's dukkha. Dukkha is the cause and the condition for the arising of faith. When someone has enough dukkha, they go on a search for a solution. And when they encounter a teaching which puts dukkha front and center as the key thing, it's the first truth of the Four Noble Truths, they recognize that. They recognize, this is what I'm looking for. That's kind of the initial arising of both faith and wisdom at the same time. Recognizing it for what it is. This is a teaching about dukkha and the end of dukkha, suffering and the end of suffering. And faith that because it puts suffering front and center, and because it's I don't know, so profoundly, clearly, comprehensively, coherently presented, that it's real, it's true. It's something worth pursuing. So right there, faith and wisdom are both arising in the mind of the person who's seeing it that way. As you practice and you listen to Dhamma talks and you read suttas and you have Dhamma discussions with other people and you try to understand the teaching, like you could say wisdom of doctrine, your understanding of the teaching itself in terms of its words, sentences, paragraphs, and concepts. Like you're able to memorize lists of things and you're able to understand how one thing relates to another. That is like an initial application of wisdom, an initial development of wisdom. But when concentration develops, you're in a unique position to experientially develop wisdom. So this is wisdom that develops from seeing for yourself how things work. So meditation practice culminates in seeing the arising and ceasing of phenomenon, seeing anicca, dukkha, and anatta. These are the three characteristics of all conditioned phenomena. And that ultimately brings the mind to a point where it's able to let go of its obsessions with the khandhas, with the five aggregates of clinging. So this is the mind and the body. When the mind's able to let go of that, it's only because it has so much faith that this is the right direction. It's developed so much energy that it's able to sustain itself on that topic long enough to see deeply. It's developed so much mindfulness that it's able to constantly be aware of what's going on inside and not miss a thing. And it's developed so much concentration that it can point itself at something and stay with it long enough to penetrate it all the way through. So these prior four faculties issue forth in the fifth one of wisdom, where the mind finally sees Nibbana. When it sees Nibbana, then your faith is no longer a faith based on trust. It's a faith based on direct experience, a direct knowing. So at that point, one becomes a stream enterer. And the Buddha says of a stream enterer that a stream enterer has four, here's another list for you. A stream enterer has four factors. There's these four factors of a stream enterer. Factors might be better translated as characteristics. And the very first one is faith. The noble disciple who's entered the stream has what's called confirmed faith. So it's no longer something that you're sort of taking because it seems reasonable, it seems to work, it's going in the right direction, etc. You've seen for yourself. So it's no longer, in a way, it's no longer really faith. It's more like knowledge. You know that the Buddha was fully enlightened. You know that the Dhamma is well expounded and that it leads inward and that it is timeless and it is to be seen by the wise. You know that the Sangha of enlightened disciples saw the same thing that you saw and that they're all on the same track as you are and that you're practicing in the right way. The stream enterer has this faith that is his number one characteristic, and that's a confirmed faith that's completely beyond any kind of wavering or doubt. And so that's also said the dropping away of one of the fetters. A stream enterer has fetters the fetters that bind beings to the wheel of samsara. And one of the most important fetters is doubt. The doubt that this is going to work, the doubt that I can do it, the doubt, maybe even the doubt that did the Buddha really teach this, or did he really know what he was talking about, or has anybody actually ever been enlightened, or are they just fooling themselves? Any kind of doubts like that are only possible if you haven't seen for yourself. Once you see for yourself, then doubt goes away. So the opposite of doubt is this confirmed faith. The other three factors of a stream enterer are virtue, generosity, and wisdom. And of course, wisdom is another one of the five spiritual faculties. It's one of the things that I really love about the Dhamma. You see this over and over again when you study it. The various factors and faculties and qualities and characteristics, they all kind of interpenetrate each other. You keep running across variations of like mindfulness in the list of the 37 aids to enlightenment. You keep seeing different variations on the idea of energy. And you keep seeing how faith and wisdom are constantly reappearing in different lists in different ways. So there's this you could say a coherence, a multifaceted singularity, unity of the Dhamma that you start to develop a taste for as you progress in the practice. There's a really beautiful sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya where Sariputta, who's the Buddha's chief disciple, gives a discourse on the five spiritual faculties and marvels at how they relate to each other, how coherent they are with each other, how much they support each other, how, in a certain sense, they're almost like just five aspects of the same exact thing, which is the seeing into the nature of reality, seeing into the Dhamma. So that's kind of an overview, if you will, of the for excellent maturity, choose wisely, for the five spiritual faculties. A way to bear it in mind. It's a tool to use to evaluate your own practice, how things are going for you. It's a summary of the entire path. Starts with faith, develops energy, depends on mindfulness, flowers in concentration, and results in wisdom. Right? So that five spiritual faculties is like a really good, that's one of my favorite lists, a really good list to memorize and have at the tip of your cognitive faculty so that you can bring it up anytime that you're thinking about Dhamma and want a starting point for an exploration. Any one of them can be taken up. I'd say that for Westerners in general, faith is a really important one. Right? That's probably the key one. That's, for me at least, that's been extremely helpful to actually put effort into developing faith and seeing the benefits of it. In a cynical age, in a material age, in an age of technology, there's a tendency to sort of overvalue knowledge and technical understanding, and to undervalue things that are sort of less marketable, like faith. Faith is kind of a heart quality. It's a sense of confidence and trust that the Buddha really knew what he was talking about, and that it's well worth your time, well worth your effort to develop a path because of what he taught and what the result is. So with that, I will cede the floor to Ajahn Punnadhammo.
Thank you for that very good summary, Tenkemuko. I'm going to conclude with a few summary remarks about particularly faith and wisdom. Tenkemuko has alluded to the way faith comes out of suffering, and this occurs in one of the sequences, the Upanishad Sutta, which provides a map or a sequence of how the mind moves from suffering to liberation. And the very first step from suffering, out of suffering, is the arising of faith. And I think this has a couple of aspects to it. One is that if the mind of a person is very immersed in suffering, if conditions internal and external are very bad, faith is really the only spiritual quality that you can arouse from that condition. And from faith comes joy, which begins the process of liberation. The mind begins moving out. So faith is required initially at the very beginning of the path. It's also required at the critical juncture towards the realization of the goal. For one who has not yet realized nibbana directly, has not seen or glimpsed the unconditioned, it remains a mystery, and it can be daunting or frightening. And the mind is being asked essentially to walk over the edge of a cliff into the abyss. This is a very old and important spiritual crux, a dilemma, and it requires a certain fearlessness, a courage in the mind to just go forward. And faith can provide that. Without faith, there's no possibility of making that critical step, and the mind will keep retreating back to the illusory comforts of what's known here. The Buddha often in his teachings used the imagery of crossing over a body of water, the near shore and the far shore. And when we're crossing over to the far shore, if you can imagine in ancient times going in a rickety little reed boat across the Andaman Sea or the Arabian Gulf, or some large body of water, there'd be some point in which you lose sight of land, and you have to have confidence that there's something on the other side. Experienced mariners would know from previous voyages that there's another land on the other side. A new sailor might be afraid and frightened and unable to leave the sight of the near shore. Now this is like the practicing the Dhamma. The near shore is what we know is this samsaric conditioned reality. And it's imperfect, it's suffering, it's impermanent, but it's familiar. We know it. And we're asked to step out, cross the abyss, cross the ocean, and reach the far shore. We need to have faith to be able to do that. Wisdom, as Tan Kamiko stated, it's the summit, the peak. In other contexts, wisdom is seen as a very high aspiration to attain wisdom. Wisdom in the Buddhist context means seeing according to reality and not otherwise. Seeing things, so it's being in a line with the truth, seeing reality. And we do this, we develop this by the disciplined, focused exercise of looking at the objects of consciousness as they arise to the mind one by one. At each moment in time, whether you're formally practicing or not, the mind will be taking an object. There's consciousness and there's an object of consciousness. And the disciplined practice is just to make that mindful, right? Bringing in this indriya, this power of mindfulness, and make it fully conscious, make the process fully conscious. And wisdom is seeing things in their own nature as they actually are. And that's harder to do than one might think, because the mind tends to see things through layers of delusion, layers colored by past history, by desire, by thought processes, by judgmental categorizations and kind of meta-analysis, bringing the mind further and further away from the bedrock reality of what's here right now, what's present in consciousness right now. And there are different aspects to that, to seeing clearly right now. You might say there's at least two facets of wisdom. There's a discriminating wisdom and there's the wisdom of equality. Discriminating wisdom is that wisdom which discerns the differences between things, the individual characteristics of things. So we look at an object in the mind and we know this is a thought, this is an emotional state, this is a sensation in the body, this is an impingement on the eye, a vision, or this is an impingement on the ear, a sound. So, we discriminate amongst the different classes of objects. This develops precision, and it's very important. We need to be able to distinguish between objects and not just have everything as a gray lumpy soup. It's quite an important part of developing wisdom. The other aspect is the equalizing wisdom, the equanimous wisdom, which sees those very critical aspects in which each object is the same. And this is the three characteristics of dukkha, anicca, anatta, suffering or imperfection, impermanence, and emptiness, voidness. And every object without distinction will have those characteristics. And seeing that the various different objects all have the same underlying characteristics is the dawning of the fullest wisdom. And with the arising of wisdom, the mind can become disenchanted. The mind can become free. It disengages from the illusions that have been binding it. And it disengages from that process. And this is what allows the mind to realize the unconditioned. And at this juncture, faith and wisdom come together because the faith is required to make that leap. And the wisdom sets the ground for it, allows it to be possible. And all of these faculties come with practice. We can develop them. It's within our capacity as human beings to develop these powers.